Is there significance to linguistics, I wonder? The way an artist words their stories, the way those words are shifted, translated. Does it matter? Even if it's the same story, is it impossible to be completely understood? Is it boring to focus on the details, or worrying to cast too little emphasis on something audiences will come to see as important? Does a maze of words lead a reader, or a viewer for that matter, to a loss of direction, misunderstanding their place within the tale? Has anything been misplaced at all when every angle looks the same? Nishio Ishin is no stranger to difficult translations fit only for those prepared to study them. Even if you read and watched both the Monogatari novels and their brilliant animated adaptations in English, you'd still be missing the point. Confusion, a sense that you've become hopelessly lost, is bound to find its way directly to you. The novels work because of their own language. They thrive in their native tongue and create extra moments of realization that, outside of themselves, cannot be translated or properly explained.
There's this video I've been trying to write for the longest time called You'll Never Understand Nishio Ishin, because a lot of it translates pretty well into English, right? But the thing that makes Nishio Ishin so amazing is the subtleties and the way that he plays around with the Japanese language, and that's impossible to translate. But it's like, how do I explain to my English-speaking audience about how you'll never understand it if you're an English speaker?
The ramblings of a madman would be easier to follow. Does that make one who reads it in its native Japanese better than one who doesn't? No, of course not. It simply showcases a difference in perspective. When animating this maze of linguistic genius, there was no clear path to take. Anyone who didn't thoroughly understand the point of the source material would have failed, and trying to capture all that entails while staying completely faithful isn't possible. Take, for example, the park scene at the beginning of Mayoi Mai Mai. In the book, it's clear that Senjogahara and Araragi are awkwardly, painfully, intensely close to each other throughout the entire discussion, that the slightest jolt would result in physical contact. The visual version, however, perhaps either bored with this immobile imagery or worried the audience would become so, uses each sentence in the same way the author of the original novel did. Each word is being emphasized by its own surroundings. We follow the entire conversation in a way that is both on the nose and deceptively vague, drawing its viewers into the conversation, promising meaning, giving it to them, and further rewarding their efforts by mocking them for it. For example, conversationally playing around as if on a jungle gym in a park that very deliberately doesn't have one. Struggling to decipher the words of someone who has trapped you in an awkwardly romantically tense conversation, struggling to keep up with her and ultimately failing to read her. And speaking on even terms, finally having given up on trying to win a game in which it's now clear that you were the only player. A back and forth, even. Then, suddenly, staring headlong directly into her butt on a meat-textured pedal bike. This spastic directing, when viewed with the additional context of a second and third viewing, and a rereading of the book in both languages, is additionally elevated. It rewards deep study and contemplation in a way that few other stories do. In short, if you're looking to solve a puzzle, this is the series for you. Be it for that reason, or perhaps the combination of well-animated action, adorable and varied waifus, and a remarkably, nay, unmistakably Japanese approach to every facet of its production, the Monogatari series has seen unprecedented success for such a mentally challenging, interconnected puzzle piece. With few exceptions, Bakemonogatari is fine art. To prove that to oneself, all one needs to do is look for coincidental plot points within the text, find the dominoes that would fall were one point to be trifled with. Connect the dots. Suddenly, it becomes clear that it had to be Mother's Day in Mayoi Mai Mai. It had to begin at a park where the equipment was old and largely removed. It had to involve two characters whose relationship with their own mothers were strained, and it had to begin with the mention of the fact that Senjogahara's own image of this town has had to change, that her home was gone, not just metaphorically, following the events of Hitagi Crab, but literally, with urban development drastically altering the landscape and removing her old home entirely. What causes one to become lost in the way Mayoi does is not a sense of physical misdirection, but a loss of identity. That's why everything here looks the same, why there's no happy end for the wandering snail, and why Mayoi's residence had to have been erased. There would have been nothing to this had it not been for those factors being as they were. And yet, significance there is and may yet still undiscovered be. On paper, Mayoi Mai Mai should have been a very short ghost story about a girl who is lost in a maze of suburbs, looking for a house that isn't there, never finding it because she never found it back then, getting lost because it is now as it was when she was hit by a truck and killed on her way to find her mother. And I say should have been, because obviously the story is on paper, and in that context too was far more than that explanation implies. Araragi having nothing better to do, and Senjogahara having obligated herself by complete coincidence to aid him in this endeavor she doesn't fully understand, accompany a lost girl to an address that once existed as something more personal. A house. A big one at that. But of course, that house is no longer present here. Its very existence was undone in the stretch of a single year. Now, where once stood a home, is nothing at all. Nothing but pavement and telephone wires. With no home to return to, a broken family with no bright future ahead, Senjogahara's only conceivable option is to keep going forward, to follow the road, metaphorically speaking. The point of Mayoi Mai Mai is to make a statement on identity. Who we are is so often tied to where we come from, but if where we come from ever transforms into a place we find ourselves unwelcome, it might as well be the same as saying that we have no home to go back to at all. That is the string that ties this story together. Araragi feels unwelcome in his own home, not by any spoken words, but by glances, hints, and what he considers to be blatant favoritism on the part of his mother. Pettiness and spite are all he's running from. Which, when paired with the plights of Senjogahara and Hachikuchi Mayoi, is placed firmly in perspective. There are those who have no family at all, those whose families have been broken as a result of divorce, and those who suffer actual abuse from their loved ones. Those who die on the road home, in a freak accident that never should have been. It's when we compare Araragi's identity to the others that we truly understand. This story is all about his perspective on life. This whole arc could not exist without him. After all, he is the only one who can see Hachikuchi in the first place. And the last time only one party could see something, it was the crab that took Senjogahara's weight. She was the only one who could see the crab because the problem was hers, and hers alone. So why do we so easily ignore this detail when it's revealed that Mayoi herself is actually long dead? A spirit wandering in search of a home, or so she says, but unable to ever find it regardless of how much help she gets. Is this pettiness too? To a degree, I suppose it could be considered as such. Rewatching the series adds much to the experience. Whereas before the subtle dialogue between Senjogahara and Araragi in the park was indecipherable, now each carefully plotted syllable rings loud and clear with purpose. Of course she's unable to see the lost cow. She never could, and wasn't necessarily facing the same problem. Showing that she's learned somewhat from the ordeal with the crab, she openly admits to feeling something at the loss of her childhood home. Though, of course, rather than force that emotional weight onto Araragi, she acts in a way befitting of someone who's recently had to take the time to process a feeling they weren't prepared to feel. Development can be good, but much is lost in the process too. The dreams of those who remember the old ways, those who grew up in a town rapidly changing at the steel hands of construction. These people will understand better than anyone the kind of heartache referred to in this moment. Even so, the weight is hers to carry. She's only here to showcase contrast in all the possible forms it may carry. Identity is not a struggle of Senjogahara's. It is Araragi's burden to bear. But being with him throughout it all, not as one who wants to ridicule or assist, but as one who loves him and wants to spend time with him, this is what Senjogahara's purpose within this tale of identity is. That is the role she occupies within this story. After all, it isn't because of the structures that we're lost. We choose to go searching for a house we no longer live in, or do the opposite and pretend as though we haven't a home to return to when we very clearly do. That the difference between abusive households and simple pettiness is real and important to comprehend should be obvious. Senjogahara is representative of that. Rather, the problem solved by Mayoi Mai Mai is much smaller, much less grand and expansive, with much smaller stakes and much smaller rewards reaped at its conclusion. Perhaps that's why it's so often forgotten about in the discussion of Bakemonogatari. Or perhaps, like the snail, like the spirit of the lost cow and everything that means, it just routinely gets itself lost on its way in.